Okay, so we're diving into some fascinating stuff today, right? You guys send in some really interesting material, and it looks like we're going deep into The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman. As always, we want to pull out what's most important for you guys, the stuff that really matters, cut through all the noise, give you that clear understanding of the core ideas.
Yeah, and one thing jumps right out from these pages, globalization. That's Friedman's big focus, and he's got some pretty specific ideas about how it's all changing.
For sure. So, in this deep dive, we're going to break down globalization the way Friedman sees it, the different stages, what's driving this latest stage, and some real world examples of how this is shaking things up for people and businesses, like everywhere. There are some pretty surprising shifts happening, and we'll be tackling some big questions about where work and competition are headed. So, let's jump right in. Right off the bat, Friedman makes this really interesting comparison between his trip to Bangalore and, get this, Columbus's voyage to India. What stood out to you about that analogy?
I think the biggest takeaway is the contrast in what they're each looking for. Columbus, he was after the tangible stuff, the gold, spices, the physical treasures of the time. Fast forward centuries, and you have Friedman searching for something completely different, something intangible but just as valuable. Software, brain power, that kind of thing. The power of the human mind, but translated into code, algorithms. And like you said, the way they each interacted with the people they encountered is really telling.
Totally. Sadly, Columbus pretty much saw the indigenous populations as a source of forced labor. But Friedman, he was trying to understand why the talent he found in Bangalore was becoming so essential to the global outsourcing of this kind of intellectual work. It really sets the stage for this idea of a massive shift in the global economy, right? And then he brings in Nandan Nilekani, who has some really insightful thoughts on how this all gained momentum around the year 2000.
Right. Nelicani talks about this convergence of key technologies, all happening at the same time. The huge expansion of broadband, cheaper and more powerful personal computers, and just this explosion of software, email, search engines, platforms for working together online. And the key thing to grasp is how all these things came together to create a real platform for intellectual work to be done remotely, so it could be delivered from anywhere. This is what he calls the disaggregation and distribution of work. It's not just about resources anymore. Now, the competitive advantage is all about how effectively you can tap into global talent and technology, no matter where you're located.
It's like this perfect storm of innovation, and it's changing how businesses operate in a really fundamental way. And this leads us right into Friedman's main framework, his three eras of globalization. So let's start with globalization 1.0. What were the defining characteristics of that first phase?
Globalization 1.0. He puts that from 1492 to around 1800. This was all about nations, countries. The driving force was basically a country's physical strength, their armies, their navies, and later, their ability to use natural resources like wind and steam power, how effectively they could project their power, control those trade routes. It was all about national competition, collaborating through countries, that kind of thing. The big questions back then were like, where does my country fit in this whole global order? And how can my nation become more powerful and wealthy?
Okay, so we're talking about exploration, colonization, empires battling it out for global domination. Then we shift into globalization 2.0, roughly from 1800 to 2000. What's the big change and what's driving globalization in this period?
In Globalization 2.0, multinational companies take center stage. They're the ones going global now. They're looking for new markets for their products, cheaper labor. They're fueled by all the advancements of the Industrial Revolution and this new way of structuring companies. The world keeps shrinking, and it's driven by these huge drops in transportation costs, steamships, railroads. And then there's this revolution in telecommunications, telegraph, telephone, PCs, the early internet. This is when you really see the emergence of a truly global economy. This flow of goods, capital, information across borders, all orchestrated by these expanding corporations. As Friedman mentions his earlier book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, that really captured this second era at its peak.
Totally. That was the age of those big global brands and the beginnings of these complex international supply chains. Okay, then we get to globalization 3.0, which Friedman says kicked off around 2000. So what sets this phase apart from everything that came before?
Globalization 3.0. This is all about individuals. Individuals now have the power to collaborate and compete globally. The world has shrunk even more. It's tiny now, and the playing field has leveled out significantly. What's driving it all? It's not brute force anymore. It's not corporate power. It's software and that global fiber optic network. Now, individuals are asking, where do I fit in this global landscape? And how can I collaborate with others across the world to create something valuable?
It's a real game changer, right? It's democratizing, but it can be disruptive too.
Hmm.
And Friedman uses some really interesting examples to illustrate this. Let's start with J. Thirth Jerry Rao. He's outsourcing accounting work from Bangalore. What's the big lesson we can learn from his experience?
Rao's outsourcing operation is a perfect example of how routine tasks, especially if they can be digitized, are going to move to where they can be done most efficiently, often across borders. He specifically talks about tax returns, things like that. So it raises a big question for you, the listener. What's going to happen to professionals who specialize in these kinds of standardized tasks? Rao's advice is that you need to find your unique value add. You need to focus on what makes you stand out. And he says that people in developed economies, like the U.S., should really focus on those touchy-feely service aspects, the kind of personalized human interaction that's harder to automate or outsource. He also talks about how businesses are breaking down their processes into smaller, more digitizable chunks. Later in the book, he's interested in this CAT scan compression technology so you can get remote medical opinions. It shows how technology can level the playing field, even in specialized fields like healthcare.
It's a bit of a wake-up call, right? You need to keep evolving your skills, develop the kind of expertise that's harder to replicate or automate. Then Friedman talks about Bill Brody from Johns Hopkins and Reuters hiring reporters in Bangalore. What does that tell us about how news reporting is changing in this flat world?
This is interesting because it shows how even journalistic work can be broken down. Brody explains how Reuters started hiring reporters in Bangalore to handle the basic nuts and bolts stuff. Reporting company earnings, basic market data, that kind of thing. It needed to be fast and accurate, but it was what they called commodity work. And because labor and infrastructure are cheaper in Bangalore, Reuters could do this much more efficiently. This freed up their more experienced journalists, the ones in places like New York or London, to focus on the higher value stuff. In-depth analysis, investigations, cultivating sources, that kind of thing. It also meant they could cover more small companies, which wouldn't have been financially viable before. Reuters' Bangalore operation grew significantly, which really highlights this global shift in how journalism is done.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff. Even knowledge-based jobs are being reshaped by this ability to distribute tasks globally. And it's interesting that the head of Reuters, Glosser, doesn't just see it as a cost-cutting measure. He sees it as a way for their top journalists to focus on more impactful work. So let's move on to Friedman's visit to the 24/7 customer call center in Bangalore. This gives us a real look at the human side of outsourced customer service, right?
It really does. You see globalization happening on a personal level. These call centers are dealing with all sorts of customer issues, from lost luggage to computer problems. They're staffed by young, often well-educated Indians who go through intense training. They even practice American accents and learn about American culture. These might be seen as low-skilled jobs in the U.S., but in India, they're often considered high-paying, high-status positions. There's even a lot of competition for these entry-level jobs. Friedman tells this funny story about one operator who thought the customer's monitor was burning. It just shows the cultural and geographical gaps they have to bridge. But the important thing is that these opportunities in Bangalore are so good that many talented Indians, even those with advanced degrees, no longer feel like they need to move to the West for a good career. And this economic growth in India actually creates more demand for American products and services. It shows how interconnected everything is in this flat world.
That's a really important point. It's not just about jobs moving from west to east. It's this two-way street. These emerging economies are growing, and that creates new demand, new opportunities for businesses everywhere. And speaking of opportunities, another sign of this is that Indian subsidiaries of big tech companies like Cisco, Intel, IBM, they're filing a significant number of patents in the U.S. That tells us something about how innovation is changing globally, doesn't it?
Absolutely. What it means is that innovation is no longer limited to those traditional R&D centers in the West. All those U.S. patents coming from India operations, it shows that they're doing high-level research and development work. Like Texas Instruments, their Indian operation is generating a bunch of patents. Intel is developing advanced microchips in Bangalore. Even GE is transferring experienced Indian engineers back to India. And get this, they're even sending non-Indian researchers to Bangalore for specialized projects. It's a clear sign that these global innovation hubs are becoming increasingly important.
And that's mirrored in Vivek Paul's career. He goes from managing GE's CT scanner business in Milwaukee to leading Wipro Technologies in India. And he tells a story about a French colleague who moves to Bangalore for GE's high-energy research. It really shows how talent and expertise are flowing globally, regardless of traditional borders. And it's not just big multinational companies. Even individual entrepreneurs are taking advantage of this, like Vivek Kulkarni and his company B2K.
Right. Kulkarni's company offers remote executive assistant services from India. It shows that even high-level admin tasks can be outsourced. Like he gives the example of creating complex PowerPoint presentations overnight. It's all about taking advantage of different time zones. They call it time zone arbitrage. So you can have work happening around the clock. Makes things much more efficient.
It's like having a super skilled virtual assistant working 24/7. And this trend isn't just about Western companies looking to India. Kenichi Omae, he's outsourcing lower-end Japanese jobs to Dalian China. It's kind of like South-South outsourcing, or in this case, East-East.
What's really interesting about the Japan-China case is the historical context. Japan colonized parts of China, and there's still some tension there. But now you see these economic forces driving this form of globalization. There are a lot of Japanese speakers in Dalian, so it makes sense for Japanese-speaking call centers and service providers to set up shop there. The tasks they're outsourcing, like data entry, you can break that down into smaller pieces and reassemble it using software. And even things like computer-aided designs for Japanese housing, they're outsourcing that to Chinese workers. It's really symbolic of how interconnected things are becoming globally. It's pretty powerful to think about Chinese workers creating digital blueprints for Japanese homes.
It really is. It shows how economic realities can sometimes overcome even deep-rooted historical issues. But outsourcing, in all its forms, isn't the only way this drive for efficiency is playing out. Friedman also talks about JetBlue and their home sourcing model, with Dolly Baker working from home in Salt Lake City. How does that fit into this whole idea of a flat world?
JetBlue's home sourcing model, where the reservation agents work from home, it's an interesting contrast to traditional outsourcing to places like India. But fundamentally, it's driven by the same motivations. It's about reducing costs, improving efficiency. David Neeleman, the guy who founded JetBlue, he believed home sourcing could lead to higher quality and better productivity. Plus, he had personal reasons for wanting to create these flexible work-from-home opportunities. So even though it's geographically different, home sourcing and international outsourcing, they're both strategies aimed at optimizing labor costs and improving service delivery. They use technology to distribute work beyond the traditional office. And the rise of remote work in the U.S. across all sorts of industries just proves this trend.
So whether it's across oceans or just across town, this ability to detach work from a central location is a huge theme in this era of globalization. And then Friedman gives this really vivid example of this. He talks about a live video feed from Iraq being monitored and discussed remotely.
That example is so powerful because it shows how real-time collaboration can happen remotely, even in a high-pressure, critical situation. They're watching events unfold in Iraq live, and they're having a real-time conversation about it via instant messaging, all from different locations. It just shows how technology can connect people across vast distances, even in these complex, rapidly changing situations.
It's a stark reminder of how interconnected and flat the world has become when it comes to information and this ability to collaborate instantly from anywhere. And of course, this flattening is causing some anxiety, especially in developed countries, about job losses. Friedman mentions a Forrester research projection about a large number of service and professional jobs potentially moving out of the U.S. because of outsourcing.
Yeah, that Forrester research projection, they estimated over 3 million service and professional jobs could move out of the U.S. by 2015. It really highlights the potential impact of these global shifts on workers in more developed economies. And while these forecasts aren't always perfect, it shows how important it is for individuals and economies to adapt to this changing landscape. We need to be proactive.
And it's not just white-collar jobs that are being affected. Even local service industries are seeing these changes. Take McDonald's, for example. They're outsourcing drive-through order taking.
The McDonald's example is fascinating. They're sending those drive-through orders to a central call center in Colorado Springs. It shows how companies are always trying to lower costs, speed up service, and maybe even reduce errors. And this is happening in an industry that seems very local. The technology that lets them take orders remotely and the fact that they're expanding this to in-restaurant ordering with tabletop devices, it all shows this trend of breaking down and centralizing tasks, even in traditional businesses.
It's a reminder that almost any job that can be standardized, digitized, and done remotely is vulnerable to these globalizing forces. And it's not just the economy that's flattening, it's impacting other areas too, like media. Friedman talks about that encounter between Bob Schieffer from CBS News and this independent journalist, Ardolino, from NBC Journal.
That interaction between Schieffer and Ardolino, it perfectly captures how media is being democratized in this flat world. Inexpensive digital tools like MP3 recorders and camera phones, they've given individuals the power to report and publish news. It's lowered the bar to entry and challenged the traditional gatekeeping role of the big media companies. Artolino, he was motivated by what he saw as bias in the mainstream media, and he achieved a lot with his basic equipment. He even played a role in the Rathergate scandal. It shows how the way news is created and shared has fundamentally changed.
It's a great example of how technology is empowering individuals in ways we never thought possible. So pulling all these different examples together, what's the overarching argument that Friedman is making in The World is Flat?
It all boils down to this. The world is going through a massive flattening process, and it's leading to these fundamental accelerating changes. Our roles are changing, relationships are changing, even the speed of change itself is changing. This increasing digitization of everything, the virtualization of work, automation, combined with unprecedented global access to powerful tools. It's creating this new era of interconnectedness and competition.
And Friedman even compares this flattening to other huge historical transformations, like the rise of the nation-state and the Industrial Revolution. He emphasizes just how fast and widespread its impact is. He uses Rothkopf's idea of pivot points in history to really drive home how significant this moment is.
Right, these historical comparisons are really helpful. They show how transformative and complex these changes are. The speed at which this flattening is happening and its global reach, that makes it totally different from any previous technological or societal shifts.
And of course, all this rapid fundamental change can be unsettling. It can create anxiety for individuals and communities. Friedman acknowledges this and stresses how crucial it is to adapt to these new realities. We can't let ourselves be overwhelmed or left behind.
It's a call to action. Individuals, businesses, entire societies need to understand these changes and embrace them. We can't resist the forces of flattening. We need to find strategies to navigate and thrive in this new global landscape.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat, it certainly gives us all a lot to think about. Given all the forces and examples we discussed, what about you, our listener? Where do you see the next big opportunities or maybe the biggest challenges emerging in this increasingly flat world? What new skills, mindsets, or approaches do you think will be essential for people and businesses to not just survive, but truly thrive in this changing environment?
That's the question for you to really ponder. It's based on what we've explored from the material you shared. Think about where you stand right now, your work, your career goals, your interests, and how they relate to these global shifts. What are the specific implications for you? This is a world of incredible potential, but also significant disruption. Understanding these dynamics, that's the first step to navigating what lies ahead.